Why is the Battle of Stalingrad considered to be the turning point of World War II? And how did a German defeat in Russia lead to Japan's surrender in the Pacific? This is a World War II special episode about Stalingrad. Back in 2020, we released an entire series on the Eastern Front. So if you want more details, it's available on another platform. But this video will give you all the highlights that you need to know about the battle itself. By August 1942, German forces had swept through most of Russia, defeating the Red Army at places like Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk, and Voronezh. They were now poised to capture the city of Stalingrad, which the Soviets had renamed to Tsaritsyn after the Russian Revolution. Why was this city so important? Well, besides being a major industrial and transportation hub, capturing Stalingrad would give the Germans control over the oil fields of the Caucasus. These included Grozny, which we talked about in our video about Operation Barbarossa. It was here where the bulk of the German troops would come from, and the Russians were very well aware of this. The Soviets had spent 2 years planning for this inevitable German attack, and they were ready. In fact, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had been trying to lure the Germans into a trap in Stalingrad ever since Barbarossa began. He even ordered the construction of several new subway tunnels under the city that could serve as barracks for Soviet soldiers. Why did Stalin want the Germans to take his soldiers to Stalingrad? Well, one reason was that the city's architecture consisted primarily of wooden buildings. So unlike what happened in cities like Kiev or Leningrad, Stalingrad could actually be rebuilt. More importantly, though, was that the open spaces south of the city made it ideal for tank warfare. Here, the Germans would have to fight according to Soviet rules of engagement rather than their own. On August 23rd, the German assault began. Over the next 6 weeks, the city's defenders fought back against the invaders. On September 12th, the Germans finally entered the city, but only 17% of the buildings remained intact. As the battle raged on, the Germans were forced further and further back by Soviet artillery fire, until they were forced to dig in along the Don River. By this time, the Soviets had re-established a bridgehead across the river, which allowed them to supply their troops within the city. In October, they launched a full-scale counterattack that drove the Germans back to the outskirts. The Soviets pushed hard, and by November had completely encircled the German troops inside Stalingrad. Inside the city, the survivors of the Sixth Army were reduced to eating rats and cats. Field kitchens couldn't operate because there wasn't enough fuel. Luftwaffe airfields were overrun and bombed. Those who weren't killed by enemy fire slowly starved to death. At least 350,000 German troops were trapped in Stalingrad. Paulus refused to order a general withdrawal because he feared the soldiers wouldn't make it out alive. He also didn't want to admit defeat to Hitler, who was obsessed with capturing the city. As a result, Paulus held out until February, when the Germans finally surrendered. It was the single largest surrender in history up to that point. But why was this battle such a turning point in the war? The first thing was that it demonstrated the limits of German military power. The German army had steamrolled through Europe in 1940 and 41, but here they were unable to take a single city. It took them 2 years just to get there. Secondly, the battle exposed the weaknesses of the Nazi system. Despite their victories in the West, Germany's economy simply couldn't support a war on 2 fronts. This was especially true when Britain switched over to a war economy after the invasion of the Soviet Union. For every 100 tanks the Germans produced, 80 went to the east and only 20 to the west. It's no coincidence that the Western Allies were able to launch D-Day just 5 months after Germany surrendered at Stalingrad. Finally, the battle destroyed the myth of German military superiority. From this point forward, the Red Army grew larger, better equipped, and better trained than ever before. They went on to liberate Eastern Europe and push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Had the Germans won at Stalingrad, it's very likely that the war would have dragged on for several more years. And it's possible that the outcome might have been very different. So how did the Soviets win this battle? Well, the first factor was the vast size of the city, like we mentioned earlier. Stalin deliberately lured the Germans into Stalingrad because it was ideal for Soviet urban warfare tactics. Unlike the Germans, the Soviets had extensive experience fighting in cities. You see, right after the Russian Revolution, there was a civil war between the Bolsheviks and the anti-communist whites. Most of this fighting took place in cities, which gave the Reds valuable experience that would pay off during World War II. Secondly, Soviets were able to replace their losses much faster than the Germans. Before the battle, Stalin had established a series of military districts in Siberia, where men could be mobilized and trained. Then once they were ready, they were sent east to reinforce the front lines. This was made possible by the introduction of the concept of total war. In June 1941, the Soviets introduced a policy known as the MOMS, Prizarek, which obligated women to take over the jobs that men had previously done. This was necessary because nearly 1 million Russian men were either killed or captured during the first year of the war. If it hadn't been for these policies, the Soviets may not have been able to keep up their momentum once the tide of the war began to turn. Finally, there was the issue of logistics. When the Germans marched into Russia in 1941, they brought almost all of their supplies with them. But as the months passed, these supplies dwindled. The Germans were also victims of their own success. After defeating the French, Italians, and British at places like Sedan, France, and Kasserine Pass, they were able to liberate huge amounts of supplies, tanks, and ammunition. So instead of shipping these supplies back home to Germany, they distributed them to their new allies in the occupied countries. This left the German army without enough supplies to wage a war in Russia during the winter. Ironically, the Nazi obsession with acquiring Russian oil never materialized. In fact, the German war machine ended up running on captured Soviet oil. So why does any of this matter today? Well, the Battle of Stalingrad has many parallels to the conflicts we see today. The first is the idea that your opponent will always underestimate you. Just like how the Germans underestimated the Soviet defenses at Stalingrad, America and our allies underestimated North Korea's willingness to fight in the early 1950s. Similarly, the Soviet Union underestimated the resolve of the Afghan people in the 1980s. In both cases, this led to military disasters. Secondly, Stalingrad shows us the importance of fighting according to your strengths. Germany's strategy in Russia relied on overwhelming firepower and blitzkrieg tactics, while the Soviets wore them down with attrition and defense. Yet it was the Soviets who ultimately won the day. Finally, the battle reminds us that no matter how powerful your enemy is, you can still beat them. The Germans were seen as invincible after sweeping across Europe, yet the Soviets found a way to defeat them. So no matter what obstacles you face, don't ever give up. If you enjoyed this video, you should check out the rest of our World War II series. We've got videos on D-Day, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Iwo Jima, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe so you can see our latest video when it comes out. Thanks for watching.